James sat on his porch, enjoying the cool breeze of the evening. It had been a long time since he left the military, and this small, quiet town was where he had chosen to settle. Life here was peaceful, far from the chaos and noise he had known during his years of service. With a warm cup of coffee in his hand and his old dog, Max, lying at his feet, James felt at ease. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood was calm, with only the sound of crickets in the background. A few children played in the distance, their laughter adding a touch of life to the stillness. James smiled as he watched them. It reminded him of simpler times, of the days when he used to dream of coming home to moments like this. As he sipped his coffee, James noticed a black van driving slowly down the street. It wasn't a car he had seen before. His town was small, and almost everyone knew everyone else. He watched as the van parked at the end of the road, and a group of young men stepped out. They were dressed casually, but something about them seemed off. They didn't greet anyone or seem familiar with the area. Instead, they kept to themselves, looking around as if they were searching for something. James's instincts kicked in. He had spent years learning to read situations, to notice the little things others might miss. Though he didn't want to assume the worst, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He leaned back in his chair, pretending to relax, but his eyes stayed on the group. Max lifted his head, sensing James's focus. The dog's ears perked up as if he, too, felt something unusual. James gave him a reassuring pat. "It's probably nothing," he muttered to himself, though his gut told him otherwise. As the evening grew darker, the group moved around the neighborhood. They didn't seem to be visiting anyone or heading toward any specific house. Instead, they lingered near the street corners, whispering among themselves. James watched closely, but they didn't do anything outright suspicious. Still, he made a mental note to keep an eye on them. He thought about calling the local authorities, but decided against it for now. After all, they hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe they're just new in town, he reasoned, though the thought didn't fully convince him. James tried to focus on his book, but the unease lingered. The world had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight, they were telling him to stay alert. By the time the streetlights flickered on, the van was gone, and the group had disappeared into the night. James sat for a while longer, staring at the empty road. He couldn't shake the feeling that this peaceful night was just the calm before the storm. As he stood to head inside, Max barked softly, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their yard. James patted him again. "Don't worry, boy. We'll be ready." The night may have seemed quiet, but James knew better than to let his guard down. Something was coming, and he was determined to be prepared for whatever it was. The next morning, James took Max for his usual walk around the neighborhood. The sun was bright, and the air carried the fresh scent of flowers from nearby gardens. It was the kind of morning that made him grateful for this quiet life. As he strolled past familiar houses, he exchanged waves and smiles with neighbors who were watering their lawns or sipping coffee on their porches. But his relaxed mood didn't last long. Near the edge of the neighborhood, James noticed the same black van from the previous night parked across the street. The group of young men was back. This time, they were standing by the van, talking in low voices. James slowed his pace, pretending to be focused on Max, but his eyes stayed on them. They didn't look like they belonged here. Their clothes were clean but rumpled, as if they had slept in them. One of them kept looking around nervously, as though checking if anyone was watching. Another leaned against the van, holding something in his hand, a folded piece of paper or maybe a map. James's military instincts flared up again. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but their behavior didn't sit right with him. They weren't just passing through. They were hanging around, and not in a friendly, neighborly way. As James walked closer, Max let out a low growl. The sound was soft, but enough to make James glance down at him. "Easy, boy," he murmured, giving Max a quick pat. One of the young men noticed James approaching and nudged the others. They all turned to look at him. their faces tense. James gave them a polite nod, trying not to seem suspicious himself. "Morning," James said casually, keeping his tone light. The tallest of the group, a young man with a shaved head, gave a tight smile. "Morning," he replied, though his voice sounded forced. James slowed his pace further, as if he was just out for a leisurely stroll. "You guys new around here?" he asked, letting Max sniff the ground nearby. "Just passing through," the tall man replied quickly. Another in the group muttered something under his breath, and they all shared a look. James didn't press further. He simply nodded and kept walking, though he felt their eyes on his back the entire time. Once he was a safe distance away, he turned a corner and pulled out his phone. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to call someone. "They haven't done anything wrong," he muttered to himself. Still, the unease in his gut wouldn't go away. He decided to call his neighbor, Mrs. Collins, who lived closer to the edge of the neighborhood. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," James said when she answered. "Have you noticed anything unusual near your place?" Mrs. Collins paused before answering. "Funny you ask, James. There's been a strange van parked nearby since yesterday. I didn't think much of it, but they've been lingering around." "Why?" James's jaw tightened. "Just noticed the same thing during my walk. Let me know if you see anything else, okay?" "Will do," Mrs. Collins replied. As James hung up, he made a silent vow to keep a closer eye on things. Something about those men wasn't right, and if they were up to no good, James wanted to be ready. He and Max continued their walk, but James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. Max, as if sensing his thoughts, stayed alert, his ears perked and his steps steady. Whatever was happening, James knew he couldn't ignore it. He just hoped it wouldn't turn into trouble. That night, James settled into his usual routine. He poured himself a cup of tea, grabbed his favorite book, and sat on the porch with Max lying at his feet. The day had been uneventful, but James couldn't shake the strange feeling from earlier. The image of the black van and the group of men lingered in his mind. He told himself to let it go, but his instincts wouldn't let him fully relax. The neighborhood was quiet as usual. The faint hum of crickets filled the air, and the occasional sound of a car passing by added to the peaceful atmosphere. James glanced down at Max, who was fast asleep, his tail twitching slightly in his dreams. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. A sharp crack, like the sound of a window shattering. James straightened in his chair, his senses immediately on high alert. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Stay," James whispered, placing a hand on Max to calm him. He set down his tea and quietly stepped into the house to grab a flashlight. His heart was steady, but his mind raced with possibilities. From the shadows of his porch, James scanned the street. At first, everything looked normal, but then he noticed movement near the house 2 doors down. His neighbor, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, were away on vacation, and their house should have been empty. Yet he could see faint figures moving inside. James's grip tightened on the flashlight. The van. The men. It all made sense now. He knew he had to act fast, but rushing in blindly wasn't an option. Years of training had taught him the value of strategy and patience. He slipped back inside and called 911, his voice calm but firm as he explained the situation. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but James knew it could take time for them to arrive. Until then, he had to keep an eye on things. James grabbed his old air horn, a relic from his military days, and a small tool he kept handy for emergencies. He crept back outside, staying hidden in the shadows. From his position, he could see 3 men inside the Petersons' home. They were moving quickly, stuffing items into bags. One of them kept glancing out the window, clearly nervous. James waited until they were all inside one room. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the air horn, the loud blast echoing through the neighborhood like a siren. The men froze, startled by the noise. James saw one of them drop the bag he was holding. The confusion gave James the opportunity he needed. He shined his flashlight directly at the window, making it appear as though someone had caught them in the act. From inside, the men panicked, shouting to each other in disarray. "Let's go," one of them yelled, and within moments, they were scrambling to get out of the house. James stayed hidden, watching as they ran toward their van. Before they could drive off, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The men hesitated, then sped away into the night, leaving behind the stolen items and a broken window. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Max barked softly, sensing the tension had eased. "Good job, boy," James said, patting his head. The police arrived shortly after, and James explained what had happened. While the men had escaped for now, the officers were able to recover evidence from the scene. James felt a mix of relief and determination. This wasn't over yet, but tonight, the neighborhood was safe. The next morning, James stood in his yard, surveying the quiet street. The events of the night still weighed on his mind. The black van was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. The Petersons' house was now a crime scene, with police tape stretched across the front door. A few neighbors had gathered, whispering about the break-in. James had shared everything he knew with the officers, but the group of men was still out there, and the van hadn't been found. He knew this wasn't the end. Whoever they were, they might come back. Later that day, James visited the Petersons' home to help secure the broken window. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about what to do next. He couldn't just sit around and hope the police would catch the intruders in time. He had spent his life preparing for moments like these, thinking ahead, staying calm, and taking action. Back at his house, James started to form a plan. First, he set up small, discrete motion sensors around the front and back of his property. These weren't fancy or expensive, just simple tools he had picked up over the years. If anyone came near his house, he'd know right away. Next, he gathered some old supplies from his garage. He found a handful of firecrackers left over from a past celebration and carefully placed them in a spot near the edge of his yard. They weren't much, but they would make enough noise to scare off anyone sneaking around. James also dusted off his old binoculars and a notebook. He decided to spend his evenings keeping watch, observing the neighborhood from his porch. His time in the military had taught him the value of patience and attention to detail, and he planned to use those skills now. That evening, James shared his concerns with a few trusted neighbors, including Mrs. Collins. He explained his plan to keep an eye on things and encouraged them to stay alert. Mrs. Collins, a retired schoolteacher, offered to help by watching from her own house. Together, they agreed to check in regularly and report anything suspicious. As the sun set, James settled into his chair on the porch with Max by his side. The streets were quiet again, but James stayed vigilant. With his flashlight, motion sensors, and firecrackers ready, he felt more prepared than ever. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The stillness of the night was both reassuring and unnerving. James's eyes scanned the dark, watching for any sign of movement. Max stayed close, his ears occasionally twitching at faint sounds in the distance. Just as James began to relax, he noticed a flicker of light in the distance. He adjusted his binoculars and saw the black van parked at the far end of the neighborhood. His heart quickened as he saw shadows moving near one of the houses. He put his plan into motion. First, he activated the motion sensors near the edge of his property. A soft alarm buzzed quietly in his pocket, confirming movement nearby. Then he set off a single firecracker, the loud crack breaking the silence and drawing attention. The shadows froze, and James saw the figures retreat. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to send a message. This neighborhood was watching. As James sat back, Max wagged his tail, sensing his owner's satisfaction. James smiled faintly. "That's round one," he murmured. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, the veteran had the upper hand. The neighborhood was quiet the next day, But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His instincts were rarely wrong. He spent the morning reinforcing his plan, making sure every sensor was working perfectly and his small stash of firecrackers was ready. By evening, James was back on his porch, his binoculars in hand, and Max resting at his feet. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the quiet was holding its breath. James's eyes scanned the street, looking for anything out of place. As the hours passed, the stillness began to feel too perfect. Then, just after midnight, James spotted a flicker of movement near the Petersons' house. His grip tightened on the binoculars as he focused. It was the same group of men. This time, there were 4 of them, moving cautiously through the shadows. They seemed more prepared than before, each carrying small bags and tools. The black van was parked nearby, its engine off, blending into the darkness. James acted quickly. He triggered one of the motion sensors, and a small light flicked on near the edge of the yard, illuminating part of the street. The sudden brightness startled the men, and they ducked behind the Petersons' fence. Max growled softly, sensing the tension. James gave him a reassuring pat. "Stay here, boy," he whispered. Armed with his flashlight and a walkie-talkie to signal Mrs. Collins, James slipped out of his house. He moved quietly, sticking to the shadows as he approached the Petersons' property. His heart pounded steadily, but his training kept him calm and focused. He reached the side of the house, positioning himself behind a tree. From here, he could see the men clearly. They were arguing in hushed voices, clearly frustrated by the unexpected light. One of them motioned toward the van, while another pointed at the house as if urging them to move forward. James took a deep breath. He didn't want to engage them directly unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he decided to scare them off once more. Carefully, he reached for his firecrackers and set them off, one after another. The loud cracks echoed through the neighborhood, sounding like gunshots in the still night. The men froze, their heads snapping in every direction. Panic spread through their group as they whispered frantically, unsure of what was happening. "Let's get out of here," one of them hissed. Before they could make a move, James stepped into view, shining his flashlight directly at them. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying a tone of authority. The men hesitated, their faces pale in the beam of light. They looked at each other, clearly debating whether to stay or run. "I've already called the police," James continued, taking a step closer. "And trust me, you don't want to be here when they arrive." That was all it took. The men bolted, scrambling toward their van. James watched as they jumped in and sped off, their tires screeching as they disappeared into the night. James stayed where he was for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. Then he walked back to his porch, where Max wagged his tail, sensing that the danger had passed. As the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, James knew the fight wasn't over. The men might be gone for now, but they weren't done. Still, tonight was a victory, and James was ready for whatever came next. The morning air was crisp as James sipped his coffee, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He had kept the neighborhood safe, but he knew it wasn't over. The men had fled, but they could return, and James wasn't about to let his guard down. Just as he was finishing his breakfast, the sound of car engines drew his attention. 2 police cars pulled up outside his house. James set his cup down and stepped onto the porch as 2 officers approached. "Morning, Mr. Donovan," one of them said, tipping his hat. "We heard about the trouble last night. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" James nodded and invited them to sit on the porch. He recounted everything that had happened, from the suspicious men to the break-in and their return the previous night. The officers listened carefully, taking notes. "You've been keeping a close eye on things," the second officer remarked. "Someone has to," James replied calmly. "These guys are smart, but they're not invisible. They'll make a mistake sooner or later." The officers exchanged a glance. "We appreciate your vigilance, but we want you to be careful. If they come back, don't confront them directly. Call us immediately." James nodded, though he knew he would do whatever it took to protect his neighbors. The conversation shifted as the officers shared updates. They had identified the black van from surveillance footage nearby and were working to track it down. They also promised to increase patrols in the area. Before leaving, one of the officers paused and turned to James. "You've got good instincts, Mr. Donovan. Your background shows. If you see anything else, don't hesitate to call." James appreciated their words, but new actions spoke louder. He watched as the police cars drove away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. That evening, James took Max for another walk around the neighborhood. He noticed his neighbors were more alert than usual. Mrs. Collins waved him over, holding a cup of tea in her hand. "James, I heard about what happened last night," she said. "Thank you for looking out for all of us." James shrugged modestly. "Just doing what anyone else would." "Not everyone would," Mrs. Collins said with a smile. "You're a good man." As James continued his walk, he felt a sense of responsibility growing. He wasn't just protecting his own home. He was protecting the entire neighborhood. That night, James settled into his usual spot on the porch. The stars sparkled above, and the streetlights cast a soft glow on the quiet street. Max lay beside him, his ears twitching as he listened for any unusual sounds. Hours passed without incident, and for a moment, James thought the men might not come back. But then, in the distance, he spotted headlights. A car slowed down near the end of the street, and James tensed. It wasn't the black van, but the behavior was familiar, slow, cautious, as though they were scouting the area. James stayed perfectly still, his flashlight ready. The car didn't stop, but it lingered long enough to make James suspicious. As it disappeared into the night, James made a mental note of its details. "This isn't over," he muttered, his determination hardening. Whatever they were planning, James was ready. He wasn't just a man on a porch. He was a protector, and he wasn't backing down. The following morning, James woke up early, his thoughts still swirling around the strange events of the past few nights. The neighborhood seemed quieter now, but he knew that the calm could be deceiving. The men who had caused the trouble might still be watching. James decided to take another walk around the area. He noticed that many of his neighbors were out, doing their usual morning chores. Mrs. Collins was trimming her hedge, and Mr. Harris, who lived across the street, was washing his car. But there was something different today. People were looking at him with a new kind of respect. As he walked past Mrs. Collins' house, she waved him over. "James, you've done more for this neighborhood than anyone could have imagined," she said with a smile. "I don't know what we would have done without you." James smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Just keeping watch," he replied modestly. "Anyone would have done the same." But Mrs. Collins shook her head. "Not everyone would. You've kept us safe, and we're all grateful." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the time James reached the end of the street, he had already been stopped by a few more neighbors, each one offering their thanks. People were calling him a hero, but James wasn't sure he deserved that title. All he'd done was stay alert and take action when needed. Later that day, as he was sitting on his porch enjoying the afternoon sun, a group of neighbors came by. Mrs. Collins led the small group, and they all had smiles on their faces. "We just wanted to do something for you," Mrs. Collins said, holding out a basket. Inside there was homemade bread, cookies, and a few small items, simple things, but full of heart. "It's not much, but it's a token of our appreciation for what you've done." James felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't the gift that mattered, but the gesture. To him, this small act of kindness meant more than any praise or recognition. "Thank you," James said softly, taking the basket. "This means a lot to me." Mrs. Collins smiled. "You've given us peace of mind. We just wanted to show we care." Later that evening, as James stood on his porch again, he noticed something different. The street felt safer, more secure. His neighbors had begun to look out for one another more. People who hadn't spoken much before now greeted each other on walks, and everyone seemed a little more alert. It was as if the events of the past few days had brought the whole neighborhood closer together. James felt proud, but not for the reasons most people might think. He wasn't proud of his actions alone. He was proud of how the community had come together, how they had all become more aware of the importance of looking out for each other. That night, as he prepared to settle into his chair for another quiet evening, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The danger wasn't over, he knew, but he had done his part. His neighbors were stronger now, more united, and he had helped them see that they could rely on one another. Max lay beside him, his head resting on James's foot. James scratched his dog's ears and smiled. He wasn't just protecting his own home anymore. He was part of something bigger. As the stars twinkled in the night sky, James realized that sometimes the greatest reward wasn't recognition or praise. It was the sense of belonging, the knowledge that you had made a difference, even in the smallest of ways. And for him, that was enough. As the days went by, James felt a sense of calm settling over the neighborhood. The men who had caused trouble were no longer in sight, and the police had increased patrols, making the streets feel safer. But something inside James had changed. He had never expected his actions to make such an impact. It wasn't just about keeping his home safe. It was about something much bigger. That evening, as James sat on his porch, his mind wandered back to his years in the military. He had always been a protector, someone who stood guard over others, even when it meant putting himself in harm's way. He had grown used to the feeling of responsibility, but he had never thought about how it would affect him once he was no longer in active service. Back then, it had always been about the mission, the next assignment, the next challenge. But now, in the quiet of his small town, James realized that he had been looking for something more. The constant movement, the noise, the action, it had kept him busy, kept him from thinking too much. Now, however, in this peaceful place, the silence left room for reflection. As he gazed out at the neighborhood, James saw it with new eyes. He wasn't just a man who had served his country. He was someone who had the power to make a difference in his own community. The skills he had honed over the years, patience, observation, and quick thinking, were just as useful in his civilian life as they had been in the military. He thought about how quickly the neighborhood had changed. When he first moved here, it had been quiet, but distant. Neighbors barely knew each other, but after everything that had happened, it felt different now. People were looking out for each other, checking in when they could, and sharing small acts of kindness. James wasn't the only one who had grown. The entire community had become stronger, more aware of the importance of being vigilant and supportive. It was something he had always believed in, unity and strength in numbers. But now he saw the reality of it. The sense of community was something that couldn't be taken for granted. He thought about the day when Mrs. Collins had come to his porch with a basket of food, and how much it had meant to him. It wasn't just the gift, it was the message behind it. They had all become more than just neighbors. They had become a team, a group of people willing to watch out for each other. And that, to James, was what mattered most. Max, who had been lying beside him on the porch, raised his head at the sound of footsteps. James looked up to see Mrs. Collins walking toward him, a smile on her face. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting down beside him. "You've really changed things around here, James. I've lived here for years, and I've never seen everyone so connected before." James smiled, but it was a humble smile. "It wasn't just me," he said. "We all did it together." Mrs. Collins nodded. "You're right, but you gave us the push we needed." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set behind the trees. The soft orange glow of the sky seemed to match the peaceful feeling James had inside. He knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but for now, the neighborhood was safe, and he had helped make it that way. As the evening deepened and the first stars began to appear, James realized that this quiet, simple life was exactly what he had been searching for. Not in the excitement of battles or missions, but in the calm of knowing he had made a difference. one step at a time. Weeks passed, and the peaceful rhythm of life returned to the neighborhood. The group of men who had caused trouble had disappeared, and the police had been keeping a closer watch. James, though, never fully let his guard down. His instincts told him that danger could always return, and he wasn't about to take any chances. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, James sat on his porch with Max by his side. He had spent the day fixing up a few things around the house, patching up a broken fence, trimming the hedges. It was quiet, just like any other evening. But then, something caught his eye. In the distance, at the far edge of the neighborhood, he spotted a familiar black van. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same van, the one that had caused all the trouble before. James sat up straighter, his instincts instantly on alert. The van had parked in the same spot it had parked on the night of the break-in. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He knew he had to be careful. They might not be the same group of men, but the van alone was enough to make him cautious. Max sensed his tension and growled softly, his ears alert. James reached for his phone and dialed Mrs. Collins's number. It rang a few times before she picked up. "James, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice concerned. "I'm not sure yet," James replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've spotted the van again. It's parked near the edge of the neighborhood. I'm going to keep an eye on it, but stay alert." "Got it," Mrs. Collins said quickly. "Let me know if you need anything." James hung up and stood up slowly, his eyes still focused on the van. He moved inside, grabbing his flashlight, and quietly slipping out the back door. Max followed closely behind him. He made his way toward the end of the street, staying in the shadows as he approached the van. The night air was still, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. James kept his steps light, careful not to draw attention to himself. As he neared the van, he noticed two figures moving inside it. They were talking in low voices, and James couldn't make out what they were saying. But he could see that they were carrying bags, similar to the ones from before. This time, however, James wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his air horn. The loud blast echoed through the night, making the men inside the van jump. For a moment, everything froze. Then the figures scrambled to open the van door and flee. James didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, shining his flashlight directly at them. "Stop right there," he called, his voice steady and commanding. The men froze again, fear in their eyes. One of them tried to run, but James was already ahead, blocking his path. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but it's over," James said, his voice firm. "Leave now before the police get here." The men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Then, without another word, they turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. James watched them go, his heart still pounding. He knew that the battle wasn't over, but tonight he had won. The neighborhood was safe once again. As he walked back to his porch, Max trotting happily at his side, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had protected his home, his neighbors, and himself. It was the kind of peace he had fought for all those years ago, and now he had found it in the quiet corners of his own life. Looking up at the stars, James felt ready for whatever would come next. He had made a difference, and that was all that mattered.